This week we're going to be talking about Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I hope that you've started and are enjoying the reading. These stories are much different than a lot of the things that we've read so far. Chaucer intended for his story to be very accessible to his audience. He wanted to have fun. He wanted to write in the language that was accessible to the most people, so he was using more of the vernacular that was spoken at the time, and we get sort of reference to this as he talks about in the prologue this sort of apology that you're discussing online, so we'll explore that there. But I want to talk just a little bit about some key ideas that will help you as you're doing the reading of the Canterbury Tales. Obviously, the setup is in the prologue, where we're looking at the idea of the pilgrimage. Now, the pilgrimage is the perfect setting for Chaucer's tale because it brings together all of these different characters from all different settings, and that allows for a lot of material for Chaucer to work with. And Chaucer does a lot of things really well in his narrative. In order to create unity and connection among the stories, Chaucer uses the prologue and the epilogues for each of the individual tales to remind us as the reader that we're on this journey, that there's the contest, and that the pilgrims are characters who are interacting with each other in addition to the individual stories that are being told. He creates these very real characters through hints in his narrative. Although he never actually directly criticizes any of his characters, we get sort of hints at his feelings about them. So, for example, in The Man of Law, in the description in the prologue, he says, "There was nowhere so busy a man as he, and yet he seemed busier than he was." That gives us some idea about what he thinks about that character. Another example would be the merchant, who is always talking about his profits, but never actually talks about his debts and how much he owes. And Chaucer spends 10 days with him, but he says, "To tell the truth, I don't know what people call him." The idea that he didn't ever get to know him that well tells us something about him as well. Chaucer also sets up these sort of antagonisms between characters. We've got, for example, the reeve and the miller. The reeve oversees a farm. The miller grounds the grain from the farm. These two characters are very suspicious of each other, and we get that sort of, they each start to tell their own story that's aimed at the other character. Another antagonism we get is, for example, the friar and the summoner. Both sort of prey upon the same gullible people, and their two stories bear witness to the animosity that they have between each other, though we don't read that story in our selections today. So all of this is happening on the way to Canterbury, the church that you see in the photograph, painting, I beg your pardon. This sort of Mecca where pilgrims would travel to see the relics and to have a sort of spiritual journey. Another way that Chaucer tries to help sort of flesh out his characters is that he makes his characters tell tales that are appropriate to their character. So, for example, the knight tells a tale about chivalry. The squire tells a tale about romantic love. The second nun tells her tale about Saint Cecilia. We get all of the tales that seem to connect with who they are as a character, and we're meant to see those as working together. And so, there are certain characters, and one of whom we'll examine in our readings for this week, the wife of Bath, who Chaucer gives sort of more complete portraits to, because we get from the wife of Bath a discussion of her in the general prologue. Her tale has a prologue, then her story itself. All three of those things work together to give quite a bit of detail about the wife of Bath. That's true of some other characters like the pardoner and others who get sort of more attention within the script, or within the poem, I should say. The other thing that I want to at least bring your attention to is the fact that, like some of the other authors that we've read before, Chaucer is not creating necessarily a new story here. His framework is a new story, the idea of the pilgrimage and the contest and people telling tales, but some of the tales actually have other sources, and he brought together a lot of different things. For example, the cleric's tale of Griselda comes from a story that was originally written in Latin and then translated into French. The Knight's Tale comes actually from Boccaccio, who we read for last time, an Italian poem. And Chaucer adapts generously from those texts, but he still uses them as his sources. The same is true of the Wife of Bath's tale. Her prologue comes from a large number of sort of anti-feminist ecclesiastical writers that were going at the time. So he again is borrowing on that tradition of storytelling and retelling tales, but in a new way. So we want to look at some sort of key ideas that were present at the time so that you can see how they play out in some of the stories. And the first one that I want to talk about, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. We got some nice imagery of some of the pilgrims on their way. But the first concept that I want to talk about is the 7 deadly sins. These appear repeatedly in the story, often the pilgrims themselves, but also the characters in their stories are guilty of these sins, and this was a pretty dominant idea during the time. And so we're not gonna spend too much time here, but I just want to cover the basics so that you'll be looking for them as you see them in the text. So the first of the 7 deadly sins, now this is how they were known at that time. So some of the words might change from what you think of, but it's close enough that you'll feel familiar. So the first one is pride, this idea a desire to be magnified, to be honored before others. Usually pride arises from the gifts of nature or fortune or grace, but from pride, that sin comes acts of disobedience, boasting, scorn, arrogance, anything that sets one apart from others. The next one is wrath, aka ire or anger, this sort of intense anger often resulting in vengeance or violence. We can have both physical wrath in terms of murder or injury to others, but we also have wrath of the tongue when we talk about swearing or even sort of the tongue lashing of verbally abusing someone else. Next comes envy. Envy is interesting. Envy is your personal sorrow at other people's gains, or joy when something harmful happens to someone else. And from envy, we get acts like backbiting or complaining or coveting something that someone else has. Next is avarice. Avarice is withholding or keeping things that you don't need. An avarice man shows no mercy towards the needful man. Now, we think of avarice most often in terms of money, people who are hoarding money in some way. But we can talk about avarice in terms of other things as well. Perhaps it's certain possessions that you're hoarding, or maybe it's food that you're keeping away from others, or whatever it is. It's this withholding or keeping of things that you don't really need. Next is sloth. Sloth's the most subtle of the sins. It's the hardest to recognize because it's not necessarily really doing injustice to another person. Sloth is thought of more as a neglect of the service of God. You have certain things according to God's plan that you should be doing, and when you neglect that duty, you are guilty of the sin of sloth. So some people think of it as laziness, but it can also just be sort of neglect of the things that you should be doing. Gluttony is next. Gluttony is an unmeasurable appetite to eat or drink. It can also be being sort of overly fussy about food or having some sort of fetish about food that's like worshiping food. But gluttony has to do obviously with excess and taking things to extreme, too much food, drunkenness, that sort of thing. And finally, we have lechery or lust, which is connected to gluttony because it's an unmeasurable appetite for sex. Premarital sex is a sin against nature and it's a form of lechery, but lechery exists even within marriage if you have that sort of uncontrolled appetite. Lechery of a wedded person is the worst kind of lechery because it goes against the sacrament of marriage. So the idea of extramarital sex or what's referred to as cuckolding is seen of as particularly problematic. How's that? These sins were called deadly sins because they were considered to put the soul of anyone who was manifesting them in sort of peril of eternal damnation. And in particular, I would say that pride was considered the primary sin because it caused the fall of Satan in heaven, and so it was seen as the most deadly of the seven deadly sins. Obviously, we could talk more about the fact that the seven deadly sins were balanced by the seven cardinal virtues: faith, hope, charity, justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude. But it's funny, Chaucer doesn't focus so much on the seven cardinal virtues. He's spending more time talking about the flaws of man and how they're partaking in those seven deadly sins. The next idea that I want to talk about is the four temperaments. We'll see this in our text as well. Essentially, this is the idea that human beings are made up of four humors. Sometimes we'll hear them referred to as four elements. But essentially, it was this notion that that a human being was made up of these competing humors or temperaments, and you had all of them in you, but one or more were dominant, more dominant than the others, and how the combination of them work together is what created your personality. So we'll often see pictures like the one you see here with all four of them together, with some sort of description explaining what they were. Let's look at each one of them separately. The first one is choleric, or the fire element. This person who has a high concentration of choleric in their temperament is a person who's hot-headed, who's easily aroused, who's inspiring or acts in extremes. They can become easily angered. We see this in the characters of the Reeve and the Carpenter in Canterbury Tales, although you're not reading those. We do see that come up in those two stories in particular. The next one is sanguine, which has to do with the element of water. This is a calm, even-tempered person, acts calmly in all sorts of circumstances, tends to be more optimistic. Sometimes they can be too optimistic, acting more cheerful than they should when they should be serious, or being too lighthearted about things. But overall, this is a pretty even-tempered sort of person. Someone who's melancholic has the air element. They tend to be serious people, more profound in the depth of their thought and feeling. They do, however, have a tendency towards mood swings, and we see this in the clerk in the Canterbury Tales. And then the last element is phlegmatic, or the earth element. This has to do with someone who is slow to move, inert. They need to be aroused and prodded into action. They're hard to inspire to action, but they're also often very devoted and very loyal people. So what would happen is there was this idea that your personality was based on your combination of these four elements, and you came by them sort of naturally. But also, there was this description, and you can see it sort of in this last slide, where you get the four elements that seem to be sort of in battle with one another. And the elements were thought to, or the temperaments were thought to, occasionally get sort of out of alignment, or that there was something off in your balance of elements. And often that would result in a trip to the barber, who was obviously the medic, or the doctor who was available. People went to the barber, and often we would get some bloodletting, either by leeches or cupping, or sometimes by cutting, where we would release some of the blood for the system in the hopes that if your body was sort of out of balance, that out of balance would be drained out and you would be able to come back to your normal self. Often this was an explanation for mental illness, but it could also be an explanation just for small things. If you were seeming out of sorts, if you were experiencing depression or anything of that nature, people would say that your temperaments or your humors were out of balance and needed to be readjusted. So those are the key ideas for this part of the mini lecture. Tune in for more in part 2 of some other key ideas about Chaucer's Canterbury Tales.